June 14th, 1944. Southern England. The German pilot from Munich had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but he'd never seen anything like the stubby-nosed fighter closing on his Messerschmitt. The British plane looked wrong somehow, too thick in the middle, nose too blunt, like someone had tried to build a fighter plane from memory and gotten the proportions off. He actually laughed into his oxygen mask. The Tommy pilots were flying something that looked like it belonged in a traveling circus, not over occupied France. Then the thing opened fire. 4 20-millimeter cannons spoke at once, and half his left wing disappeared in a cloud of aluminum and fire. The Tempest, that graceless, thick-bodied fighter the Luftwaffe pilots had been mocking for weeks, had just blown him out of the sky in a single pass. As his 109 tumbled toward the French countryside, the pilot from Munich had 3 seconds to wonder how they'd all been so wrong. Flight Lieutenant James Morrison from Manchester watched the German fighter spiral down, already looking for the next target. 6 weeks ago, he'd been hunting V-1 flying bombs over the Channel, the RAF's last-ditch effort to stop Hitler's vengeance weapons from reaching London. The Tempest had been perfect for that work, fast enough to catch the unmanned bombs, stable enough to fly alongside them and tip their wings with his own, sending them crashing into empty fields. Simple work, really. Point defense. Nothing glamorous. The other fighter squadrons flying Spitfires and Mustangs had called them the doodle-bug hunters, not quite real fighter pilots. Morrison hadn't cared much. He was 24 years old and had already survived 3 years of war. Glory was for dead men and idiots. But then intelligence had started noticing something. The Tempest squadrons were not just catching V-1s. They were bouncing German fighters over France and winning, not just surviving, winning decisively. The ugly duckling that nobody wanted was shooting down Germany's best fighters at a ratio that made the Spitfire look ordinary. The plane that looked like someone had fed a typhoon too much breakfast was becoming the best low-altitude fighter in the European theater, and the Germans hadn't figured it out yet. They kept laughing at it, right up until those 4 cannons removed their wings. Morrison's Tempest was doing 200 miles per hour at 8,000 feet, its massive Napier saber engine singing the deep bass note that pilots learned to love. 24 cylinders arranged in an H pattern, producing 2,400 horsepower. The engineers from Bristol who designed it said it was the most powerful inline engine ever put in a British fighter. The mechanics who maintained it said it was 24 cylinders of pure hatred trying to shake itself apart. Both were right. When it worked, nothing could touch a Tempest below 15,000 feet. When it didn't work, you became a very fast glider looking for somewhere soft to crash. The squadron had started with 36 pilots. After 6 weeks of V-1 hunting, they were down to 19. Not from enemy action, the flying bombs didn't shoot back, and the German fighters had mostly left them alone during the doodlebug days. No, they'd lost pilots to engine failures, structural failures, landing accidents in the beast that demanded respect with every flight. The Tempest had killed more of its own pilots in training than the Germans had in combat. It was like flying a barely controlled explosion that happened to have wings attached. The mechanic from Birmingham who kept Morrison's plane running had explained it once. The Sabre engine ran so hot it could melt its own sleeve valves if you didn't manage the temperature perfectly. The propeller turned so fast it created gyroscopic forces that could flip you inverted if you turned too hard. The plane was so heavy, 5 tons empty, 7 tons loaded, that if you stalled it, you needed 3,000 feet to recover. Maybe. If you were lucky. If God loved you that day. Morrison checked his fuel gauge. Enough for another 20 minutes over France, then back across the channel. Below him, the Norman countryside looked almost peaceful, if you ignored the smoke columns from yesterday's bombing and the occasional flash of artillery. The invasion was 8 days old. The papers were calling it a success, but from 8,000 feet, Morrison could see the truth. The Allied armies were still bunched up near the beaches, struggling to break out against German defenders who knew they were fighting for their homeland now. Every mile inland cost blood. Every hedgerow hid a machine gun. Every crossroads had been zeroed by German artillery years ago. That's when he saw them. 6 Focke-Wulf 190s in perfect formation, heading northwest toward the invasion beaches. They were flying at 5,000 feet, probably looking for targets of opportunity among the Allied shipping. Ground attack configuration from the look of it. Bomb racks under the wings, flying heavy and slow. Morrison smiled grimly. In a Spitfire, he would have had to dive from altitude to catch them, giving up his energy advantage. In the Tempest, he could simply push the throttle forward and run them down like a wolf chasing sheep. He keyed his radio. Blackjack Squadron, this is Blackjack Leader. 6 trade at 10 o'clock low, heading 300, going down to play. The other 3 Tempests in his flight acknowledged. Morrison knew them all. Flying Officer Williams from Cardiff, 20 years old, and thought he was immortal because he'd survived a month of combat. Sergeant Johnson from Leeds, quiet type who'd been a schoolteacher before the war and wrote letters to his wife every single night. Flight Lieutenant Patterson from Edinburgh on his second tour because he couldn't figure out what else to do with himself besides fly and fight. They rolled into their attack dive. 4 Tempests, dropping like hammers toward the German formation. The Focke-Wulfs hadn't seen them yet. Too busy scanning the ground for targets, not expecting fighters this far inland. Morrison lined up on the trailing 190, watching it grow in his gun sight. At 400 yards, he could see the pilot's head in the canopy. At 300 yards, he could read the squadron markings on the fuselage. At 200 yards, he pressed the firing button. The Tempest's 4 Hispano cannons fired as one, sending a stream of 20mm shells into the German fighter. The 190's armor was good, designed to protect the pilot from ground fire, but it wasn't designed for this. The shells punched through the rear fuselage, walked up into the engine, and finally reached the fuel tank. The Focke-Wulf disappeared in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. No parachute. There never was when you hit the fuel. The other Germans scattered like startled birds, jettisoning their bombs and breaking in different directions. One tried to climb, fatal mistake against a Tempest. Patterson was on him in seconds, those massive cannons removing the German's tail in a single burst. Another tried to dive for the deck, probably hoping to use his superior roll rate to escape. Williams followed him down, patient as death, waiting for the German to level out. When he did, Williams put a 3-second burst into his cockpit. The 190 flew straight into a wheat field at 300 miles per hour. Morrison pulled up hard, fighting the Tempest's weight as he searched for another target. The G-forces crushed him into his seat, 4, 5, 6 times his body weight. His vision started to gray at the edges, that familiar tunnel that meant you were about to pass out. He eased off the stick slightly, letting blood flow back to his brain. That's when he saw the 109 trying to sneak up on Johnson. "Break left, Blackjack 3, break left!" Johnson's Tempest snapped into a violent left turn, and the 109's cannon shells passed through empty air where he'd been a second before. Morrison rolled inverted and pulled through, bringing his nose around in a pursuit curve. The German pilot was good, immediately recognizing the threat and pulling into a climbing spiral. In any other British fighter, he might have escaped. The Spitfire would have struggled to follow that climb. The Typhoon would have stalled, but the Tempest had power to burn. Morrison firewalled the throttle, feeling all 2,400 horses kick him in the back. The chase lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like an hour. The 109 pilot tried everything: barrel rolls, split S maneuvers, even a desperate attempt at a hammerhead turn. But physics doesn't care about desperation. The Tempest was faster, climbed better at low altitude, and turned inside the 109 below 10,000 feet. Morrison waited until he couldn't miss, then fired a half-second burst. The cannon shells blew the 109's engine apart, sending pieces of Daimler-Benz through the cowling. Oil sprayed across the German's windscreen, and the prop windmilled to a stop. This time there was a parachute. The German pilot, probably no older than 20, bailed out cleanly and pulled his ripcord. Morrison watched him float down toward a cabbage field, already thinking about where the French resistance might be waiting. The war on the ground was uglier than the one in the air. At least up here, death was usually quick. Blackjack leader. This is Blackjack 4. I've got 2 more climbing from the south. Angels 15 and climbing. Morrison checked his fuel again. 10 minutes left, maybe 12 if he nursed it. The 2 climbing Germans were probably trying to get to altitude where their fighters performed better, where the Tempest's weight became a liability instead of an advantage. Smart tactics. But they'd started their climb too late. Blackjack 4, stay low and watch for more trade. 2 and 3 with me. They climbed hard, the 3 Tempests clawing for altitude. At 12,000 feet, Morrison could feel the plane getting sluggish, not happy about the thin air. At 14,000, it was actively fighting him. But they only needed to get high enough for one good pass. The Germans had made the classic mistake. They'd climbed in a straight line, trading speed for altitude. When Morrison's flight reached 15,000 feet, the 2 109s were sitting ducks, hanging on their props at minimum speed. The attack was almost anticlimactic. 3 Tempests diving on 2 climbing 109s. Williams got the first one, walking his cannon shells from the tail to the cockpit. The plane simply came apart in the air, pieces falling like confetti. Johnson got the second, though it took 2 passes. The German pilot tried to dive away after the first attack missed, but diving was the Tempest's natural element. Johnson followed him down and finished the job at 8,000 feet. 6 German fighters destroyed in less than 5 minutes. Morrison felt no particular satisfaction. They'd been ground attack planes, caught heavy and low. It was like a professional boxer fighting drunks outside a pub. Necessary maybe, but nothing to brag about. The real German fighters, the Expert 10 with their 100-plus victory tallies, those were different. Those were the ones who'd learned to respect the Tempest the hard way. He remembered the first time they'd encountered real opposition. 2 weeks ago, just after they'd transitioned from V-1 hunting to fighter sweeps. A staffel of 109s from Jagdgeschwader 2, the Richthofen wing. Elite pilots flying superior aircraft at 20,000 feet. The Spitfire squadrons had warned them. Don't climb above 15,000. Don't try to turn with them. Don't give them a chance to use their advantage. Good advice for staying alive. Terrible advice for winning wars. Morrison had taken his flight up anyway, climbing until the Tempests were gasping in the thin air. The Germans had laughed, actually laughed over the radio, one of them speaking English just to mock them. The ugly birds trying to fly with eagles. Go home, Tommy. Go back to chasing robots. The mockery had stopped when Morrison's wingman put a burst into their formation leader. Even at altitude, even struggling in thin air, the Tempest's cannons hit like sledgehammers. One good burst was all you needed. The German formation had scattered, diving for the deck, where they thought they'd have the advantage. they learned otherwise. Below 15,000 feet, the Tempest transformed from ugly duckling to bird of prey. Morrison's flight had shot down 3 of them in the running battle that followed. The Germans had stopped laughing after that. Blackjack, leader. Fuel state. Morrison checked his gauge again. 5 minutes to bingo fuel. The point where you had just enough to make it home. 5 minutes, then we go home. They reformed and headed west, staying at 8,000 feet where the Tempest was happiest. The engine temperatures were all in the green, oil pressure good, everything running smooth. Morrison allowed himself a moment to appreciate the machine. Yes, it was ugly. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, it would kill you if you gave it half a chance. But when everything worked, when you understood its rhythms and respected its demands, it was magnificent. The radio crackled. All Blackjack aircraft, this is Kenley Control. Large formation of trade heading your way. Angels 5, approximately 30 plus bandits. Can you investigate? 30 plus. Morrison felt his mouth go dry. 4 Tempests against 30-something German fighters. The smart play was to report their fuel state and head home. Let someone else deal with it. But 30 German fighters heading toward the invasion beaches meant Allied soldiers dying. It meant ships burning. It meant the invasion potentially failing. Kenley Control, Blackjack leader. We'll have a look. He could feel the other pilot's surprise through the radio silence. Williams finally spoke up. Leader, we're at bingo fuel in 3 minutes. I know. We'll make one pass and run for home. They found the German formation 2 minutes later. Not 30 planes, closer to 40. A full group of Focke-Wulf 190s flying in perfect formation at 5,000 feet. These weren't ground attack planes either. These were fighters, probably moved up from Germany to try to contest the invasion. Fresh pilots, fresh planes, fresh confidence. They hadn't learned about Tempest yet. Morrison's hands were sweating inside his gloves. 4 against 40 wasn't combat. It was suicide. But they had altitude, they had speed, and they had surprise. One pass, he told himself. One good pass and run like hell. Blackjack flight, finger 4 formation. We go through them once and keep going. Don't turn back, don't get slow, don't be heroes. Pick your targets and make them count. They rolled into their dive. 4 Tempests against 40, Focke-Wulfs. The Germans still hadn't seen them, maintaining their rigid formation as they headed toward the coast. Morrison picked the lead plane in the nearest swarm, watching the range counter in his head. 400 yards, 300, 200. All 4 Tempests fired at once, 16 cannons speaking in harmony. The result was instant chaos. 4 German fighters exploded or spun away, trailing smoke. The formation scattered like a school of fish sensing a shark. Some climbed, some dove, some turned left or right. The radio exploded with German voices, surprised and angry. Morrison held his dive, pushing through the formation at 400 miles per hour. A 190 flashed past his canopy, so close he could see the pilot's eyes. Another tried to line up a deflection shot, but was way too slow. The Tempest punched through the German formation, like bullets through paper, leaving confusion and destruction in their wake. Keep going, don't turn back. But Williams had already broken the rule. Morrison saw him pulling up hard, trying to line up another target. A fatal mistake. 3 190s were on him immediately, cannon shells sparking off his wings and fuselage. The Tempest was tough, but not that tough. Williams's plane started trailing black smoke, then white vapor. Coolant, probably. Maybe fuel. Get out of there, Blackjack 2. Williams tried to dive away, but his engine was dying, the massive Sabre finally succumbing to battle damage. Morrison watched him roll inverted and bail out. his parachute opening cleanly. The Germans didn't shoot at him as he descended. Whatever else they were, the Luftwaffe still followed the old rules about parachuting pilots. Blackjack flight, heading 270, maximum speed. They ran for the channel, 3 Tempests at full throttle, fuel gauges dropping toward empty. Behind them, the German formation was reforming, but they weren't pursuing. They'd lost 4 planes and had their formation scattered. The invasion beaches would be safe from them today. Morrison's engine started coughing 5 miles from the English coast. Fuel starvation. He switched to his reserve tank, the last few gallons that might get him home. Johnson's plane was trailing smoke, thin white wisps that meant his engine was burning oil. Patterson seemed okay, but looks could be deceiving with battle damage. They crossed the coast at 500 feet, engines running on fumes and prayer. Kenly was still 20 miles away. Morrison started looking for fields to put down in, the eternal calculation every fighter pilot learned. That one's too short. That one has cows. That one might work if the engine quit right now. Johnson's engine quit first. The massive Sabre simply stopped, probably out of oil or with 1 too many cylinders cracked. Morrison watched him dead stick toward a cricket ground, gear up, hoping for the best. The Tempest hit hard, gouging a massive furrow across the carefully maintained grass, but it stayed in one piece. Morrison saw Johnson climb out and wave. Patterson made it to Kenly's circuit before his engine started missing. He declared an emergency and landed straight in, no pattern, no ceremony. Morrison followed him, his own engine running on the last tablespoon of fuel. The Tempest touched down harder than he intended, bouncing once before settling. The engine quit while he was still rolling, finally out of fuel after giving everything it had. Morrison sat in his cockpit for a moment, hands shaking with adrenaline let down. 4 against 40, and they'd all survived. Williams was probably a prisoner by now, but alive. Johnson had walked away from his crash landing. They'd shot down 6 German fighters, maybe 7, and disrupted a major attack on the invasion fleet. Not bad for ugly ducklings. The ground crew was already swarming his plane, checking for battle damage. The crew chief, a master sergeant from Manchester, who'd been fixing planes since the Great War, climbed up on the wing. "How'd she handle, sir?" "Like a dream, Sergeant. Like a bloody dream." The sergeant grinned, showing a gold tooth. "That's what they all say, right up until the engine explodes. You've got 14 holes in your fuselage, by the way. Jerry got closer than you thought." Morrison looked where the sergeant was pointing. Cannon shell holes, neat and round, stitching across his tail section. He hadn't even felt the hits. The Tempest had just absorbed them and kept flying. That evening, the squadron intelligence officer debriefed them. A thin man from Oxford who'd probably never been closer to combat than a cricket match, but he knew his business. He showed them reconnaissance photos taken an hour after their engagement. The German formation had turned back, mission abandoned. The invasion beaches had been spared another day of hell. "Your actions prevented significant casualties among the landing forces," the intelligence officer said in his precise Oxford accent. "Conservative estimates suggest you saved at least 200 lives, possibly more." Morrison thought about Williams, probably sitting in a German interrogation room right now. He thought about Johnson, lucky to walk away from that crash. He thought about those 40 German fighters, any one of which could have killed them. They'd rolled the dice and won, but the dice were loaded against them. The next morning brought new orders. The squadron was to focus on ground attack missions, supporting the Army's breakout from Normandy. Morrison read the orders with mixed feelings. Ground attack was necessary work, but it was also the most dangerous flying in the war. German flak batteries had years to perfect their craft, and they didn't miss often. Flying low and slow over German positions was like playing Russian roulette with anti-aircraft guns. The mechanic from Birmingham had Morrison's Tempest ready by noon, the battle damage repaired, fuel tanks full, ammunition loaded. 4 20-millimeter cannons, each loaded with a mixture of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. 8 rocket projectiles under the wings, each with a 60-pound warhead. Enough firepower to destroy a tank column or level a building. The ugly duckling had become a fire-breathing dragon. They took off at 2 in the afternoon, 8 Tempests in 2 flights of 4. Morrison led the first flight. Patterson had the second. Their target was a German supply depot near Caen, identified by the resistance as a major ammunition dump. If they could destroy it, the German defense of Caen would weaken. If they couldn't, the depot would keep feeding shells to the guns that were slaughtering Allied soldiers. The flight to the target was almost peaceful. They stayed at 8,000 feet above the light flak but below the heavy guns. The Norman countryside spread below them like a patchwork quilt, if you ignored the smoke and craters. Morrison had flown over this same area in 1940, retreating from the German blitzkrieg. Now he was back, and the Germans were the ones retreating. Slowly, stubbornly, making the Allies pay for every yard, but retreating nonetheless. The depot appeared exactly where intelligence said it would be. A cluster of camouflaged buildings and vehicles, trying to hide in a small wood. From 8,000 feet, it looked insignificant. Morrison knew better. Each building probably held tons of ammunition. Each truck was loaded with shells or fuel. Destroying this depot would save Allied lives, hundreds of them maybe. Blackjack flight, echelon right. We go in from the north, 1 pass each. Watch for flak. They rolled into their attack dive, 8 Tempests in perfect formation. At 4,000 feet, the flak started. Black puffs of smoke, each one representing 4 pounds of steel fragments looking for flesh and aluminum to tear. Morrison ignored it, focusing on his target, the largest building in the complex. At 2,000 feet, he fired his rockets, 8 trails of smoke streaking toward the target. At 1,000 feet, he pulled up hard, G-forces crushing him into his seat. The explosion was visible from 5 miles away. Morrison's rockets had found something volatile. Ammunition, fuel, maybe both. The building didn't just explode, it erupted like a volcano. The blast wave caught Patterson's Tempest, flipping it inverted. Morrison watched him fight for control, rolling upright just before hitting the trees. Jesus Christ. The whole place is going up. Secondary explosions rippled through the depot, each building detonating in sequence as the fire spread. The Germans had stored too much in too small an area, and now they were paying for it. Morrison climbed back to altitude, watching the destruction below. A pillar of smoke rose 10,000 feet into the air, visible from the invasion beaches, 20 miles away. But the Germans weren't passive victims. The flak intensified, drawing a curtain of steel around the surviving Tempests. Morrison felt his plane shudder as shrapnel peppered the wings. Someone's engine was hit. He could see the telltale black smoke, but couldn't identify the plane in the chaos. Blackjack flight, egress west, maximum speed. They ran for safety. 8 Tempests becoming 7 as one fell away, trailing fire. Morrison didn't see who it was, didn't have time to look. Survival took all his concentration. The Tempest was heavy with battle damage, pulling to the left, engine running rough. But it kept flying, kept fighting, refused to quit. They made it back to Kenley with 2 planes so damaged they'd never fly again. One pilot didn't make it back at all. Flight Sergeant Davies from Bristol, 22 years old, engaged to a nurse from London. His Tempest had taken a direct hit from an 88-millimeter shell. No parachute, no chance, just gone in an instant of fire and metal. Morrison stood next to Davies's empty dispersal bay that evening, thinking about letters that would have to be written. He'd known Davies for 6 months, flown dozens of missions with him. A good pilot, careful but aggressive when needed. He'd been talking about his wedding plans just yesterday, how he was going to surprise his fiancée with a honeymoon in Scotland after the war. The squadron commander found him there. Wing Commander Thompson, 41 years old, veteran of the Battle of Britain, more kills than anybody kept track of anymore. He'd been flying fighters since 1935, back when they were biplanes made of wood and canvas. Tough loss, Thompson said, lighting a cigarette. Davies was a good man. They're all good men, sir, right up until they're dead. Thompson nodded, understanding the bitterness. The depot you hit supplied 3 German divisions. Intelligence estimates you've disrupted their operations for at least a week. That's a week our boys won't be getting shelled. Worth one of ours for hundreds of theirs? You tell me, sir. You've been doing this longer. Thompson took a long drag on his cigarette. 9 years of war, Morrison. Spain, France, Britain, now France again. I've lost more friends than I can remember. Each one hurts. But if we don't do this, if we don't fly these missions, more people die. Davies knew that. He knew what he was risking and why. Morrison wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the arithmetic of war that reduced men to numbers on a balance sheet. But Thompson was right. They all knew the deal when they strapped into their fighters. You flew, you fought, and if you were lucky, you survived. If you weren't lucky, you hoped it was quick. The next morning brought reports from the resistance. The depot they'd destroyed had been even more important than intelligence thought. Not just ammunition, but specialized anti-tank rounds the Germans desperately needed to stop the Allied advance. Without those rounds, German positions near Caen were running low on armor-piercing capability. The British Army was able to advance 3 miles in a single day, the furthest advance since the invasion began. Morrison felt no satisfaction from the news. 3 miles gained, 1 pilot lost. The arithmetic of war ground on. But he climbed back into his repaired Tempest that afternoon, leading another mission against German positions. Because that's what you did. You flew, you fought, and you tried not to think about empty chairs in the mess hall. The reputation of the Tempest was spreading through both air forces. The Germans had stopped laughing, started respecting. Intelligence intercepted Luftwaffe communications warning pilots about the thick-bodied British fighters that dominated low-altitude combat. One German ace, credited with 80 victories on the Eastern Front, had been shot down by a Tempest on his 3rd mission over Normandy. He'd survived, bailing out over German territory, but his report had been sobering for the Luftwaffe High Command. The Tempest, he wrote, was unlike any British fighter he'd encountered. Fast, heavily armed, and flown by pilots who understood its strengths. Morrison read the translated report with grim amusement. The German ace had complained that the Tempest didn't fight fair, didn't engage in the turning battles that had been the hallmark of fighter combat. Instead, Tempest pilots used their speed and firepower to slash through German formations, refusing to get slow, refusing to play by the old rules. It was, the German wrote, ungentlemanly aerial assassination rather than knightly combat. Good, Morrison thought. The days of knightly combat had ended when the Germans bombed London. This was industrial war, and the Tempest was a perfect tool for it. Ugly, brutal, and effective. 2 weeks into the Normandy campaign, the squadron received new pilots to replace their losses. Fresh faces from training units, young men who'd learned to fly on Tigers, Moths, and Harvards, never seen combat, never heard shots fired in anger. Morrison was assigned to train 2 of them, Pilot Officer Mitchell from Cornwall, 19 years old, and Flight Sergeant Anderson from Glasgow, 21. Their first training flight nearly ended in disaster. Mitchell, eager to prove himself, tried to turn with Morrison at low altitude. The Tempest didn't turn like a Spitfire. It needed room, needed speed, needed respect. Mitchell's plane snapped into an accelerated stall at 800 feet, rolling inverted before he could react. Morrison watched him fight for control, dropping to 300 feet before recovering. 300 feet? Another second, and he'd have been a crater in a farmer's field. "Never do that again," Morrison told him after they landed. "The Tempest isn't a ballet dancer, it's a sledgehammer. Use it like one." Anderson learned faster, maybe because he was naturally cautious. Maybe because he'd watched Mitchell nearly die. He kept his speed up, didn't try to turn tight, used the Tempest's strengths instead of fighting its weaknesses. Within a week, he was ready for combat. Mitchell took longer, struggling to overcome his Spitfire training, his desire to be a graceful fighter pilot instead of a brutal killer. Their first combat mission together came on July the 2nd. A fighter sweep over Normandy looking for targets of opportunity. Morrison led them across the channel at 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid most flak, low enough that the Tempests were still responsive. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, unlimited visibility, the kind of day that made you forget there was a war on. They found trouble near Falaise. 8 Messerschmitt 109s escorting a reconnaissance plane, probably photographing Allied positions. The Germans were flying at 20,000 feet, confident in their altitude advantage. Morrison smiled. They still hadn't learned. Blackjack flight, targets at 2 o'clock high. We climbed to engage. He could hear Mitchell's nervous breathing over the radio. First combat. Morrison remembered his own, over France in 1940, flying a Hurricane against overwhelming numbers. He'd been so scared he'd forgotten to release his gun safety until the third pass. Survived by pure luck more than skill. They climbed hard, the Tempest straining in the thin air. At 18,000 feet, Morrison could feel the plane getting mushy, not happy about the altitude. But they didn't need to get to 20,000. They just needed to get close enough to make the Germans come down. Blackjack 2 and 3, stay low. Watch for them to dive. 4, with me. Morrison and Anderson continued climbing, while Mitchell and another pilot circled below. It was a trap as old as aerial warfare. Bait them down to where you're strong. The Germans saw them coming, 2 Tempests struggling upward, easy prey for superior 109s. The German flight leader couldn't resist. He rolled over and dove, bringing 4 planes with him, leaving 3 to guard the reconnaissance aircraft. The diving Germans were confident, experienced, probably Eastern Front veterans with dozens of kills. They came down in perfect formation, setting up for a head-on pass. Morrison let them come, waiting until the last second before breaking hard left. The Tempest might be sluggish at altitude, but they could still turn when needed. The Germans flashed past, overshooting, suddenly realizing they'd been suckered into diving to 15,000 feet. Now, Blackjack 2 and 3. Mitchell and his wingman climbed to meet the diving Germans, catching them as they tried to zoom back to altitude. Mitchell's first combat shots were perfect. A 3-second burst that walked up the fuselage of a 109, shattering the canopy and killing the pilot instantly. The young pilot from Cornwall, who'd nearly killed himself in training, had just scored his first victory. The battle became a swirling melee at medium altitude, exactly where the Tempest wanted to be. Morrison shot down one 109 with a deflection shot that removed its tail. Anderson got another with a patient pursuit that ended when the German tried to outclimb a plane with 2,400 horsepower. The remaining Germans fled east, including the reconnaissance plane they'd been protecting. "Good shooting, Mitchell," Morrison radioed. "Welcome to the war." They landed back at Kenley with no losses, 4 victories, and 1 reconnaissance mission disrupted. Mitchell couldn't stop grinning, the adrenaline high of surviving first combat mixed with the pride of a kill. Morrison let him enjoy it. The boy would learn soon enough that killing men, even enemy pilots, wasn't something to celebrate. It was just something you did to survive and go home. That evening, word came down from Fighter Command. The squadron was being moved forward to a temporary airfield in Normandy, just behind the front lines. They would be closer to their targets, able to fly more missions, provide better support to the ground forces. They would also be within range of German artillery and infiltrators. The comfortable quarters at Kenley would be replaced by tents in French fields. Hot meals would become cold rations. They were trading safety for effectiveness. Morrison packed his kit that night, not much to pack, really. Spare uniforms, shaving kit, letters from home that he read and reread until the paper was soft as cloth. A photograph of a girl from Manchester who'd promised to wait for him. She'd stopped writing 6 months ago, but he kept the photo anyway. A talisman, more than a memory now. The transit flight to Normandy took 30 minutes. Morrison led 12 Tempests across the channel, watching the invasion fleet below. Hundreds of ships, thousands of vessels, the greatest armada in human history. From 10,000 feet, it looked like you could walk from England to France on steel decks. The scale of it still amazed him. All this effort, all these resources, all these lives, to defeat an evil that should never have been allowed to grow. The temporary airfield was just a steel mesh runway laid over a wheat field, with dispersal areas hidden under camouflage netting. No hangars, no proper maintenance facilities, just the minimum needed to keep fighters flying. Morrison's tent was 50 yards from his plane's dispersal, close enough that he could hear the mechanics working through the night. Their first mission from the forward base came that evening. Intelligence had identified a column of German tanks moving toward the British sector, trying to reinforce a crumbling defense line. 24 tanks, probably Panthers or Tigers, enough firepower to stop an entire division if they reached their destination. Morrison led 8 Tempests into the twilight, hunting. They found the column exactly where intelligence said it would be, strung out along a country road, moving without lights to avoid detection. From 3,000 feet, the tanks looked like beetles crawling through the dusk. Blackjack flight. Echelon left. Rockets first pass, cannons on the second. They dove from the north, using the setting sun to blind German gunners. Morrison picked the lead tank, a Tiger by its distinctive shape. At 1,000 feet, he fired all 8 rockets. They streaked down trailing smoke, bracketing the massive vehicle. 2 direct hits on the turret, 1 on the engine deck. The Tiger lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. Burning or disabled, either way, it was out of the fight. The other Tempest had similar success. Rockets were tricky weapons, unguided, dependent on pilot skill and luck. But when they hit hard. Morrison counted 4 tanks, definitely destroyed, 3 more probably disabled. The column scattered, tanks leaving the road to seek cover in orchards and hedgerows. Second pass, cannons only. Watch for flak. They came around from the east, lower this time, 500 feet off the deck. The Germans were ready now, machine guns chattering from tank cupolas. 20-millimeter flak guns they'd hidden in the column firing streams of tracers. Morrison felt hits on his wings but kept his run steady. His cannon shells sparked off a Panther's armor, walking up to find the weak spot where turret met hull. The tank's ammunition exploded, blowing the turret completely off, sending it spinning through the air like a 50-ton frisbee. Mitchell got too eager on his run, staying too long on target. Morrison saw the flak converging on him, streams of tracers from multiple sources. The young pilot's Tempest staggered as shells found their mark. His port wing folded up, structural failure from too much damage. The plane rolled inverted and went straight in from 400 feet. No chance for a parachute, no chance for anything. 19 years old, 2 weeks in combat, dead in a French field, he couldn't have found on a map 6 months ago. The rest of the squadron made it back to base, battle damaged but flying. Morrison's plane had 43 holes in it. Anderson's was missing half its rudder. The mechanic from Birmingham just shook his head and got to work, knowing they'd need these planes flying again by morning. Morrison sat on an ammunition box outside his tent that night, listening to artillery rumble in the distance. The front lines were only 12 miles away. He could see flashes on the horizon, somebody getting shelled, somebody dying. Mitchell's tent was already being cleared out, his possessions boxed up to send home. 2 weeks. The boy had lasted 2 weeks. At this rate, none of them would survive the summer. The padre found him there, a Methodist minister from Wales who'd volunteered to be closer to the fighting. He didn't say anything at first, just sat on another ammunition box and pulled out a flask of brandy. Good brandy, too, probably liberated from some French chateau. "Mitchell?" the padre asked. "Yeah, 19 years old. I'll write to his parents, unless you'd prefer to." Morrison took a drink of brandy, feeling it burned down his throat. "What do you tell them? Your son died destroying German tanks in a field in France? He lasted 2 weeks? He was getting better, but not fast enough?" "I tell them he died doing his duty, defending freedom. All the usual words that don't help much." The padre took his own drink. "Sometimes I mention something personal if I knew the boy. Mitchell talked about his dog a lot, spaniel named Chester. Maybe I'll mention that he talked about going home to his dog." They sat in silence for a while, sharing the brandy, listening to the war. Mosquito bombers droned overhead, heading for Germany. Somewhere to the south, machine guns chattered, probably a probe of the lines. The war never stopped, never slept, just ground on consuming lives. "We're winning," the padre said eventually. "Intelligence says the Germans are running out of everything. Fuel, ammunition, pilots. Another few months and it'll be over." "Another few months?" Morrison laughed bitterly. "Know how many pilots we'll lose in another few months? Mitchell was number 11 since D-Day. 11 out of 36. At this rate, I'll be writing letters about you, Padre." The next morning brought new orders and bad news. The squadron was to focus on bridge destruction, stopping German reinforcements from reaching the front. The bad news was that the Luftwaffe had moved 2 Jägerschwadern from Germany to France, nearly 150 fresh fighters with experienced pilots. The easy days of shooting down ground attack planes were over. Morrison studied the map in the operations tent, marking bridges and known flak positions. The Germans defended their bridges like they were made of gold, rings of anti-aircraft guns, making any attack a gamble with death. But without those bridges, German tanks and supplies couldn't reach the front. Every bridge destroyed meant Allied lives saved. The first bridge mission nearly ended his war, a railway bridge over the Orne, vital for German logistics. Morrison led 4 Tempests in at first light, hoping to catch the defenses sleeping. They weren't. The Germans had moved in 2 new batteries of 88mm guns during the night, plus multiple 37 and 20mm positions. Morrison made his attack run at 300 miles per hour, 50 feet off the water, so low his prop wash left a wake. The bridge grew in his windscreen, a lattice of steel and concrete that looked impossibly solid. At 500 yards, the world exploded in tracers and flak bursts. At 300 yards, he fired his rockets, At 100 yards, he pulled up hard, missing the bridge superstructure by feet. Behind him, the bridge erupted. Not destroyed, but damaged, twisted steel and broken concrete blocking the rail line. Good enough, but the price was high. 2 Tempests didn't make it. One flew straight into the bridge, the pilot probably dead at the controls. The other took a direct hit from an 88, disappeared in a ball of fire and aluminum confetti. Anderson made it back with Morrison, his plane streaming fuel from punctured tanks. He landed dead stick, engine quitting as he touched down, rolling to a stop at the very end of the runway. When he climbed out, his flying suit was soaked with sweat, and he was shaking so hard he couldn't light a cigarette. "I counted 16 guns," he said. 16 guns shooting at 4 planes. "Tomorrow there'll be 20, Morrison replied. They learned too. 3 days later, the intelligence about Luftwaffe reinforcements proved accurate. Morrison was leading a patrol at 15,000 feet when they bounced 12 brand-new Focke-Wulf 190s. Not the ground attack versions they'd been fighting, but pure fighters, the latest models with upgraded engines and weapons. The pilots were good too, probably veterans from the Eastern Front, where they'd been fighting Soviets for years. The engagement lasted 12 minutes but felt like 12 hours. Morrison shot down one 190 with a lucky deflection shot, watched another Tempest explode under concentrated fire, saw Anderson force a German to bail out after a patient pursuit. But these Germans didn't run. They stayed and fought, using their superior altitude performance to maintain advantage. Morrison's ammunition ran out first, his cannons clicking on empty chambers. He called for disengagement, leading the surviving Tempest in a diving escape toward the coast. The Germans followed for a while, taking long-range shots, but eventually turned back. They'd won this round, and they knew it. Back at base, Morrison counted the cost. 3 Tempests lost, 2 pilots dead, 1 probably prisoner. In return, they'd shot down 2, maybe 3 German fighters. The mathematics were changing. The Luftwaffe might be running out of fuel, but the pilots they were sending up now were their best, their most experienced. Every combat was getting harder. The crew chief found Morrison that evening, doing paperwork by candlelight in the operations tent. The grizzled sergeant looked worried, an expression Morrison had never seen on his face before. "We need to talk about the planes, sir." "What about them?" "They're worn out. These engines are supposed to be overhauled every 100 hours. Some of ours have 300 on them. We're using baling wire and prayers to keep them running. I've got 3 planes that shouldn't fly tomorrow, but will because we don't have replacements." Morrison put down his pen. "How long before we start losing planes to mechanical failure?" "We already are, sir. That crash last week wasn't combat damage. Engine seized. Connecting rod let go, punched right through the crankcase. The pilot was dead before he could bail out." They looked at each other across the flickering candle. Both knew what this meant. They were flying time bombs, machines pushed beyond their limits, maintained by exhausted mechanics with inadequate supplies. It was a race now. Would the war end before the planes simply stopped flying? Do what you can, Sergeant. That's all any of us can do. July turned to August, and the battle for Normandy ground on. The squadron flew 3 missions a day sometimes: dawn patrol, noon ground attack, evening fighter sweep. Morrison stopped counting his combat hours. It didn't matter anymore. You flew until you died or the war ended, whichever came first. The Tempest reputation continued to grow. German pilots had specific instructions now. Don't engage Tempests below 15,000 feet unless you have numerical superiority. Don't turn with them. Don't try to outdive them. Use hit-and-run tactics. Use altitude advantage, but don't get into a knife fight with the ugly British fighter. Morrison read a captured German document that called the Tempest the British Executioner. He found it grimly appropriate. That's what they'd become, executioners. Not knights of the air, not gallant fighter pilots, just efficient killers in efficient killing machines. Late August brought a breakthrough. The German line finally collapsed at Falaise, turning retreat into rout. Morrison flew over the killing fields, the roads choked with destroyed vehicles and dead horses. The smell reached them even at 3,000 feet. Death and cordite and burning fuel. It was victory, but it looked like hell. They chased the retreating Germans across France, moving to new airfields every few days, always staying close to the front. The Luftwaffe resistance grew weaker, many of their planes grounded for lack of fuel. When German fighters did appear, they were often flown by inexperienced pilots, teenage boys thrown into combat with minimal training. Morrison shot down his 20th aircraft on September 3rd. A Messerschmitt 109 flown by someone who couldn't have had more than 50 hours in type. The German pilot tried to turn with Morrison at 5,000 feet, a fatal mistake. Morrison put a 2-second burst into his cockpit, watching the 109 spin down trailing smoke. No satisfaction in it. It was like shooting children. Patterson didn't make it to September. Flak got him over a railway yard near Brussels. Morrison saw it happen, the ugly black bursts bracketing Patterson's Tempest, until one connected. The plane simply came apart in the air, wings folding, fuselage breaking, pieces falling like leaves. Patterson never knew what hit him, which was probably a mercy. His replacement was a flight lieutenant from the Channel Islands, a pilot named Thornton, who'd been flying since before the war. He'd survived the Battle of Britain, Malta, North Africa. Morrison thought he might last longer than the others. He was wrong. Thornton died on his third mission with the squadron, bounced by a lone Focke-Wulf 190 that came out of the sun. One burst, cockpit hit, instant death. Even experience couldn't save you from bad luck. By October, the squadron was operating from Belgium, still flying the same exhausted Tempests, held together by determination and mechanical genius. The crew chief from Birmingham had become a magician, somehow keeping planes flying that should have been scrap metal. Morrison had seen him literally wire a wing on after structural failure, the repair lasting just long enough for one more mission. The Germans were falling back to their own borders now, the Third Reich shrinking by the day, but they weren't giving up. V-2 rockets fell on London. Jet fighters appeared over the battlefield, Me-262s that could outrun anything the Allies had. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. But it wasn't over yet. Morrison encountered his first jet in November, leading a patrol near the German border. The 262 appeared from nowhere, flashing past at 500 miles per hour, impossible to catch. It made one pass, cannons sparking off Morrison's wings, then disappeared into cloud before anyone could react. The future of aerial warfare, and it made the Tempest look like a biplane. But the jets were few, and the Tempests were many. Morrison's squadron continued their grinding work. Ground attack, fighter sweeps, escort missions. They lost planes to flak, to fighters, to mechanical failure, to pilot exhaustion. New faces appeared and disappeared so quickly, Morrison stopped learning names. What was the point? They'd be dead in a week or two anyway. December brought winter and the German offensive in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge, the newspapers would call it later. Morrison flew through blizzards, finding German columns by the tracks they left in snow. The Tempest's massive engine kept running in temperatures that grounded other fighters, the Sabre somehow functioning at 20 below zero. He remembered one mission in particular. December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, 8 Tempests attacking a German armored column near Bastogne. The Americans were surrounded, running out of everything, needing a miracle. Morrison's squadron was part of that miracle, destroying German tanks that were only miles from the American perimeter. They went in low under the clouds at 300 feet. The Germans were caught in the open, no cover in the snow-covered fields. Morrison's rockets found a King Tiger, the heaviest tank the Germans had. Even the mighty Tiger couldn't survive a direct hit from a 60-pound warhead. It burned in the snow, crew bailing out, some of them on fire, rolling in snowbanks to extinguish the flames. Anderson got hit on that mission. Flak, as always. His engine quit, streaming coolant, and he bellied into a snow-covered field. Morrison circled, watching him climb out and wave. Captured, probably, but alive, another letter to write. Anderson had been with the squadron 5 months. Practically a veteran by their standards. Christmas Day, they stood down for 12 hours. Morrison sat in his frozen tent, eating American rations the Yanks had shared, turkey and stuffing from a can, tasting like cardboard but better than British rations. He thought about home, about Christmases before the war. His mother's roast goose, his father's terrible jokes, his younger brother who'd joined the Navy and was somewhere in the Pacific. All of them scattered by war, maybe never to reunite. The Padre held a service in the mess tent. 20 pilots attended, all that was left of a squadron that had numbered 48 in June. Morrison didn't pray, hadn't prayed since his first combat mission years ago, but he stood with the others, singing carols while artillery rumbled in the distance. Silent night, with a backdrop of war. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. January 1945 brought hope and desperation in equal measure. The German offensive had failed. The Allies were advancing again, but the Germans fought harder the closer the Allies got to Germany itself. Every mission over German territory meant intense flak, desperate Luftwaffe attacks, the cornered wolf fighting to the death. Morrison's Tempest finally died on January 15th, not from combat but from exhaustion. The Sabre engine, after 500 hours of abuse, simply gave up. A bearing failed, then a piston, then the whole bottom end let go in a catastrophic explosion of metal. Morrison was at 8,000 feet when it happened, giving him time to bail out over Allied territory. He landed in a turnip field, was picked up by Canadian troops, and was back flying a replacement Tempest the next day. The replacement was fresh from the factory, everything tight and new. It felt wrong after months in his old plane, like wearing someone else's clothes. But it flew, it fought, and that's all that mattered now. The war was in its final months, everyone knew it. The question was who would survive to see the end. February saw them operating over Germany itself. The Rhine was crossed, the heart of the Reich penetrated. Morrison flew over cities reduced to rubble, factories still smoking from bomber raids, refugees clogging every road. It was devastation on a scale he couldn't comprehend. Entire cities erased, populations fled or dead. This was what total war looked like. The Luftwaffe was dying but not dead. They still came up, flying anything that could get airborne. Morrison encountered everything from the latest fighters to training planes with machine guns bolted on. The German pilots were mostly boys now, 15 and 16-year-olds, who should have been in school. Morrison shot them down and tried not to think about it. March brought spring and more losses. The new squadron commander, Thompson had been killed in February, was a wing commander from London who'd spent most of the war behind a desk. He lasted 4 missions before flying into a hill in bad weather. His replacement, a South African named van der Merwe, understood the Tempest and the war. He also understood they were all living on borrowed time. "We're the cleanup crew now," van der Merwe told them at a briefing. "The strategic bombing's done its work. The armies are advancing. We're just keeping Jerry's head down until it's over. Don't be heroes. We've had enough heroes. Be survivors. Morrison took the advice to heart. He stopped volunteering for extra missions, stopped pushing his luck. He'd survived longer than he had any right to. 22 confirmed kills, probably 30 more damaged or destroyed on the ground. He'd done his part. Now he just wanted to go home. April 1945. The war was measurably ending. Morrison could see it in the empty German airfields, the white flags appearing in villages, the German soldiers surrendering in droves. He flew a mission on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, strafing a German headquarters. No opposition, no flak, just buildings burning and Germans running. It felt less like combat and more like murder. His last combat mission came on April the 25th, a patrol over what was left of German-held territory. They found nothing. No fighters, no flak, no targets, just a broken country waiting for the end. Morrison flew for 3 hours over Germany, seeing only destruction and defeat. The Third Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, hadn't made it to 12. On May 4th, word came through that German forces in Northwest Europe had surrendered. It would be official on May 8th, but the war was over. Morrison was in the dispersal hut when the news arrived, cleaning his pistol out of habit. He looked around at the 5 other pilots present, all that remained of his flight. They'd started with 12. Nobody cheered, nobody celebrated. They just sat there, exhausted, unable to process that they'd survived. Morrison had been at war for 5 years. He'd forgotten what peace felt like, what it meant to not wake up wondering if this was the day you died. The Tempest had carried him through it all, the ugly duckling that German pilots had laughed at, until they learned better. The fighter that wasn't supposed to work but became the best low-altitude killer of the war. Morrison walked out to his plane that evening, running his hand along its blunt nose. The machine had saved his life dozens of times, carried him through hell and back. "Thanks, old girl," he said quietly. "We did it." VE Day, May 8th, 1945. Morrison stood with the remnants of his squadron on the flight line, watching Tempest perform a victory flyover. 12 planes in perfect formation, the survivors of a squadron that had started with 48. The crowd cheered, waved flags, celebrated the end of the European war. Morrison felt nothing but tired. The statistics would come later. The squadron had destroyed 87 aircraft in air combat, probably 300 more on the ground. They destroyed countless tanks, vehicles, trains, bridges. They'd lost 31 pilots killed, 8 prisoner, 12 wounded badly enough to never fly again. The mathematics of victory. Morrison went home on leave in June. England looked the same but felt different. Or maybe he was different. He couldn't relate to civilians who complained about rationing when he'd seen French children starving. He couldn't listen to people talk about their hardships when he'd seen cities reduced to ash. He spent most of his leave alone, walking the hills around Manchester, trying to find some peace. The girl who'd promised to wait hadn't. She'd married an American soldier in 1944. Morrison didn't blame her. 5 years was too long to wait for someone who might never come home. He threw away her photograph, the talisman that had stopped working long ago. In July, they offered him a posting to the Pacific, flying Tempests against the Japanese. He turned it down. He'd done his part, killed enough men, survived enough close calls. Let someone else finish that war. He was 26 years old and felt ancient. The surrender of Japan in August meant he could leave the RAF. Morrison signed his discharge papers in September, handed in his wings, and walked away from flying forever. He never sat in a cockpit again, never went to air shows, never joined veterans' organizations. That part of his life was over, sealed away like a tomb. He went back to his pre-war job at an engineering firm in Manchester. His boss, who'd spent the war making aircraft parts, treated him like a hero. Morrison hated it. He wasn't a hero. He was just someone who'd survived when many hadn't. The real heroes were buried in French fields, Belgian forests, German cities. The nightmares started in October, always the same. Flak bursts walking toward his plane, controls not responding, the ground rushing up. He'd wake soaked in sweat, heart racing, hands gripping imaginary controls. The doctor, a veteran of the Great War, understood. "It'll fade," he said. "Takes time, but it fades. The mind needs to understand the danger's over. Some men drink to forget, some work. Find what works for you." Morrison found work helped. He threw himself into engineering, designing bridges, ironically enough. Structures to connect rather than destroy. He was good at it, promoted quickly, respected for his precision and attention to detail. Skills learned calculating deflection shots and fuel consumption translated well to civilian engineering. He married in 1947. A schoolteacher from Leeds named Margaret, who didn't ask about the war, didn't push him to talk. She understood his silences, his occasional stares into distance, his reluctance to travel to Europe. They had 2 children, boys who grew up knowing their father had been in the war, but not what he'd done. The Tempests were scrapped mostly. Too expensive to maintain in peacetime, too specialized for civilian use. Morrison heard they cut them up for aluminum scrap, melted down the engines for steel. All that engineering, all that power reduced to raw materials. He didn't mourn them. They were weapons, and the world didn't need them anymore. Years passed. The nightmares faded, but never disappeared entirely. Morrison would go months without one. Then, something. A sound, a smell, a particular quality of light would trigger the memories. He learned to live with it, like living with an old injury that ached when it rained. In 1965, 20 years after the war, his eldest son asked him about his service. The boy was 18, same age Morrison had been when he joined the RAF. Morrison told him the basics: fighter pilot, Tempest, survived the war. Nothing about the killing, the friends lost, the cities destroyed. What was the point? How could someone who hadn't been there understand? Anderson wrote to him in 1970. He'd survived the POW camp, come home, become a doctor in Glasgow. He was organizing a squadron reunion, wondering if Morrison would attend. Morrison politely declined. What would they talk about? The war? That was done? The present? They were strangers now, connected only by shared trauma. Patterson's widow contacted him in 1975. She was writing a book about her husband. Wanted Morrison's memories. He met her for tea. A graceful woman who'd raised 3 children alone. He told her Patterson had been brave, skilled, respected. All true. He didn't tell her about Patterson's fear before every mission, the way his hands shook, the bottle of whiskey he kept hidden in his flight bag. She didn't need those truths. The Imperial War Museum asked him to record his experiences in 1985. Morrison declined. Others could tell the story of the Tempest, the missions, the victories. He'd lived it once. That was enough. Let historians sort through the records, count the kills, analyze the tactics. He just wanted to forget. Margaret died in 1990. Cancer, quick and brutal as flak. Morrison retired, sold the house, moved to a cottage in the Lake District. He lived quietly, walking the hills, reading, avoiding anything to do with aviation or war. His sons visited monthly, his grandchildren occasionally. They knew him as a quiet grandfather who built excellent model bridges, not as someone who'd killed dozens of men before his 27th birthday. In 1995, the 50th anniversary of VE Day, the BBC wanted to interview him. One of the last Tempest pilots, they said. A chance to tell the story of the forgotten fighter. Morrison refused. The Tempest didn't need its story told. It had done its job, ugly and brutal and efficient. That was enough. He kept one photograph from the war, not of his plane or squadron mates, but of a French village they'd helped liberate. Children waving, women crying, old men saluting. That was worth remembering. Not the killing, but the reason for it. The freedom those children would grow up with, bought with aluminum and blood. Morrison died in December 2000, aged 81. His son found him in his chair, book open on his lap, finally at peace. They buried him in a small cemetery overlooking Windermere, no military honors per his wishes. Just a simple stone with name and dates, nothing about the war, the victories, the Tempest. But sometimes, on clear days when the RAF trains over the lakes, you can hear the echo of engines. Not jets, but pistons, 24 cylinders of controlled fury. The ghost of Tempest that German pilots laughed at until they learned better. The ugly ducklings that became angels of death, then scrap metal, then memory, then nothing at all. The last surviving pilot from Morrison's squadron died in 2003. With him went the last first-hand memories of those desperate months over Europe, when ugly British fighters proved that beauty didn't win wars, efficiency did, brutality did. Young men willing to strap themselves into barely controlled explosions did. The Tempest was never famous like the Spitfire, never beloved like the Hurricane. It was the working fighter of the late war, doing the ugly jobs with ugly efficiency. It deserved better recognition, perhaps, but it wouldn't have cared. It was built to fight and kill and survive, not to be remembered. In that way, it was exactly like the men who flew it. Today, only one complete Tempest survives in flying condition. It performs at air shows occasionally. That distinctive saber engine note, startling audiences used to Merlins and Allisons. People watch it fly, thick-bodied and purposeful, and wonder how something so ungraceful could have been so deadly. They don't understand that grace was a luxury in war. What mattered was speed, firepower, and the ability to bring your pilot home alive. The Tempest did all three better than almost any fighter of its time. German pilots who laughed at it in June 1944 were dead by August, victims of their own preconceptions. The ugly duckling had turned out to be a bird of prey, and by the time they realized it, it was too late. The hunter had become the hunted, the laughing had stopped, and the Tempest had written its place in history with cannon fire and rocket trails. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's incredible survival stories. If you found it compelling, give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates these tales of courage. And don't forget to subscribe for more.